Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 25th of April. My name is Maggie Lennon. Before I introduce my guests today, I'll run through the latest coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, there were 177 newly confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 4 newly reported deaths of people who had tested positive. 2,764,607 people have received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccination and 993,180 have received their second dose. On Saturdays and Sundays, at the moment, only headline statistics on new cases, deaths and vaccinations are now being updated. And since the start of the pandemic, a total of 1,895,925 people in Scotland have been tested. And of these, 1,671,074 tests were negative, with 224,851 positive tests. But sadly, 7,651 people who have tested positive for COVID have died in Scotland. Joining me today from Edinburgh and the North East is Anthony Salamone, Managing Director of Euro Merchants, a Scottish EU and global political analysis company, and Fatima Joji, who is an SNP regional list candidate in the North East. Welcome to you both. I thought we'd start today, given that all the main manifestos have now been published, with a quick roundup of what we're seeing. Now, Anthony, you let it slip that you've had to read all of them, and that is time you won't get back. I have some sympathy. So my reading of some of them is that there's quite a lot of convergence across a number of areas. There's a lot of common themes. What are the themes you've picked out?
Well, obviously, we're talking about the coronavirus pandemic and the kind of economic recovery that we might expect to see, but also, of course, sort of more generally a sort of social recovery as well. We know the pandemic has forced us all to reconsider how we lived our lives previously and how we might do so differently. Of course, all the parties, the 5 parties in Parliament plus the Alba Party, all have different views on how they would like to take that forward. I suppose what's most interesting is the way in which independence now fits into that conversation. That through obviously SNP Greens and Alba in their different ways and different strategies, suggesting that through independence, Scotland would be able to make that kind of economic and social transformation. Obviously, the unionist parties are arguing something different. I suppose also for me, given my focus on EU issues, it's fascinating to see the way in which, particularly the Tories and Labour, have sort of pretended that Brexit doesn't exist. Even the Conservative manifesto doesn't mention Brexit by name once in the manifesto, and they offer no suggestions on what they prefer Scotland's relationship with the EU to be. I think at this critical juncture, it'd be really useful for all political parties to say very clearly what they think Scotland's relationship with the EU should be, and what they propose if they're not content with either EU membership for Scotland under independence, or if they're happy with the Brexit deal that we have.
Maybe they just don't have any vision. Maybe that's the problem. There's a lot of, as I say, key themes. There's a lot about youth unemployment, about upskilling, tax breaks for smaller businesses around the economy. I feel that there's maybe been a few chances missed. I'm not seeing anything about real fundamental change about the way that business operates, or big business operates, for example. Could some of the manifestos, Anthony, been more radical?
Well, I suppose that in today's world, it's a question of which sort of level is it best to have, the kind of transformation. So, for instance, we're talking about trying to tax digital companies like Amazon more for the profits that they make and the relative little tax they pay. That could be challenging, not just for Scotland, but even for the UK to do on its own. It's a question of what is the European Union doing on that, and what is the world globally doing on those kinds of issues. So yes, I'm sure we could have seen more ambition, but it's also trying to, about building coalitions and alliances in Europe and globally to try to make some of these changes, because otherwise, companies will just shift from one place to another to do whatever they think is most convenient for them. So we really do need to see some global solutions on these issues.
Fatima, one of the areas where there has been quite a lot of ambition expressed across most manifestos is about climate change, with very ambitious targets, a desire to have a green recovery, to kind of put Scotland at the centre of leading on climate change. I've said before on this programme that to me, there's been an awful lot of focus on, carbon neutral energy efficiency, which I sometimes think puts a huge onus on us, the public. It's up to us to change our car. It's up to us to insulate our houses. We might get fined if we don't, or we might not be able to sell our houses if we don't insulate them properly. I think we've missed an opportunity to look at climate change in a more organic way around land reform and maybe taking control of the food chain. I'm imagining both of these issues are fairly live issues up in the Northeast.
No, absolutely. But I think it's important to understand that it's possibly down to the way that these messages are communicated by parties and individuals who are pushing the climate change narrative. Because absolutely, we do need to look at our individual habits. We are the people in this world, and our habits are contributing to climate change. But we also need to look at the way these big businesses who are pushing out profit are also damaging our economy. But it is that we do need to take a responsibility as individuals. So I do think that narrative is fair. But how we communicate the message and how much pressure we put on individuals rather than looking at the practices of these big companies is another discussion to be had as well. Up in the Northeast, things like a just transition are important, and how we lead our climate justice fund as well. Because we are we are a region that relies on the oil industry for employment, job security, and obviously the current practices are a contributor to climate change. So things like just transition and how these bodies operate are important to us up in the Northeast, but our habits too are also important. So I think the focus on whether it's the individual or whether it's a organizations or companies, I think it's kind of differs slightly across regions, but we really need to be clear on how fair we make the communications and how clear we are in terms of responsibilities.
I think that's critical. Otherwise, what tends to happen is people tend to think the green agenda is a kind of nanny state agenda, and there's lots of finger wagging. Nobody wants fingers wagged at them at the moment. We've all been through a horrific year. But just picking up on just transitions, I know that you're able to canvass at the moment. I know you've been doing hustings. So is the just transition plan, is the just transition vision selling well in the Northeast? Because obviously that is the area that has the greatest amount of potentially losing jobs as we move away from oil and gas. How do people respond to that?
So it is a bold and ambitious change that we have proposed in our manifesto, and it is needed in every aspect of our lives if we are to safeguard the future of our people and the planet. And we are determined to do this in a way that avoids the mistakes of the past. Which saw like coal and steel workers, their families and communities abandoned during the deindustrialization of the 80s and the 90s, for example, if my memory serves me correctly. So an SME government did say that we will deliver a just transition, and we will implement the recommendations of the Just Transition Commission, and we will we will appoint a minister of just transition with the responsibility for overseeing a national mission of fairness and opportunity as we move to net zero. And in terms of these arguments working on the ground, I do feel that they are well received in terms of how we're approaching it. Because what we're trying to do, we're trying to balance the potential of keeping jobs and also to ensure that we operate in a green way. And I think most people, when we talk about just transition, are worried about, job losses, etc. But we can operate in a green way. We can become that green energy capital as well. So I think moving and making use of the energy transition as well. These cells are working quite well on the doorstep, I feel.
Okay. Anthony, yesterday someone asked me how any of the parties were going to afford this amazing shopping list they've produced. You look at all of the manifestos, they've all been costed. We are millions here, 500 million there, 750 million there, 1.2 billion. A lot of money. And somebody said, how are they going to pay for it all? And I said, I'm not a politician, I don't know. But it is very evident, I think, from all of the manifestos, lots of potential on spending, very little on tax. So, could we have seen more progressive taxation brought in? I mean, SNP have said they won't increase taxation. And for heaven's sake, When are we going to see the reform of council tax, which has been talked about for decades? So again, are these missed opportunities in the manifestos?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I think first off, it's pretty clear that in response to our current economic crisis, a political consensus, a welcome political consensus, has developed that it's worthwhile to spend and invest rather than pursue austerity, which I think is a positive development in any case. So in terms of these kinds of, this is a time to invest. Of course, most countries that are making investments are borrowing, and obviously Scotland, in our current constitutional and fiscal situation, we only have limited capacity to do that, which is a challenge. But I also think that it is worth it to try to make those kinds of investments. And when it comes to something like reforming council tax, it's very very interesting to see both here in Scotland, but of course in Ireland and other parts of Europe and the world, there is really debate on reforming the sort of property taxes generally, moving to sort of land value taxes. It would be good to see that. It'd be good to see some consensus on those kinds of moves. So
Yeah, I
yes,
think it's
it
long
is important.
overdue. I think that's one area that a lot of people would like to see movement on. You talk about political consensus, and of course that is, as we've said, across the recovery plans exists. But where it doesn't exist, of course, is on the attitudes of independence. And there have been consistently now a few polls in the last few weeks, Fatima, that have shown that the small lead that the Yes movement had for independence has reversed, and that now no voters have just an edge. I think the latest was 49 yes, 51 no, once don't knows were stripped out, which is the lowest it's been in nearly a year. On the other hand, when you look at the most latest Survation poll, it is suggesting that between the SNP and the Greens, there could be 78, so a majority, I think that is of 16 for pro-independence parties elected in 2 weeks. So what's happening? Why are those two results seemingly at odds with each other?
I think it's down to the fact of whether you have a single issue narrative or whether you have one that is a combination of so many. And I think that's why I think some people might come for me for this, but I do feel that's why it's important that we stay away from the narrative of independence for independence sake, because people care about policies. If you look at the latest polls, people at the top of people's concerns is the NHS and then the economy by far before independence. And the SNP have shown great leadership in this, for example, and how we are handling these devolved issues, which can convince people who are concerned about other things as well as independence, because it just goes to show that a single issue faction is not going to work. You'll end up appealing, you're not going to appeal to the majority, because we are concerned about what we're going to put on our table. I always say that independence and other issues are not mutually exclusive. Like for me, I care about independence and social justice, independence and equality, independence and job security, independence and social mobility. But if you come to some people and just say, oh, independence for independence sake, it's not going to be a sell. People need to know policies. People need to know how you're going to vote on certain issues. People want to know how you are going to do so when we become independent as well. And for that, they will look to how you govern at present, and they will also look at your policies. So I do feel that this is really working well for parties like the Scottish National Party, because we have been really clear on our policy directions and what we believe in, as well as independence, and we need independence to further these goals. So we really need to need to balance these out, policies and independence. We can't just focus on the linear argument. And I think some people don't understand that just that linear argument is actually a turn off to voters that we need to win. So I
So,
think that's what the poll
kind of
suggests.
reading or
Yeah.
hearing between Fatima's words, Anthony, I think she's having a bit of a pop at Alba there, because they're the ones that are independence for independence. Did you think the Alba presentation of independence, which is pretty flag waving, lots of historical references, lots of references to running things up flagpoles and pictures of Mel Gibson, probably, I don't know, I haven't really been watching what they're up to. Do you think is that what's turning some people off independence? Because there seems to be this mismatch. Lots of people are going to vote for independence supporting parties in Holyrood, which means there will be a referendum, hopefully, and yet people are saying they don't want to vote for independence. So is some of that lie at Alba's door?
Well, just on the question of the polls first, I mean, I think it's really they're really close. It's really hard to tell when you've got 49, 51 or whatever it is, 50-50, whether you're including people who are decided or undecided voters. I think it's, particularly when things are in the margin of error, it's basically a toss-up. But I suppose what you want to do is compare that to how opinion was, for instance, a year ago. It's clear that it's narrowed, that more people are supporting independence now than they were before, even if there isn't a clear majority for independence. I imagine that would be considered progress. What's the role of the Alpha Party? Well, that's hard to tell because they're so new. Having read their manifesto and all the others, it was certainly the thinnest and the least specific, and certainly the most focused on independence. You might say for independence sake, but we really can't say how many votes they'll get and what difference that will make to the overall picture. But is it putting people off from independence? Well, we've got about around 10% or so, most polls say, of people who are undecided on independence. Of course, you could still change your mind even if you declare yourself to be decided. But I imagine that 10% or so would be more looking to sort of what the SNP are saying, or their economic arguments, for instance, maybe what they're saying on the EU. And I suppose if put it this way, if the Alpha Party does not perform well at this election, polls 1 or 2%, for instance, doesn't elect any MSP, I don't think they'll necessarily have as much of an influence as they'd hope to have. But obviously, even if they're still there after the election, they can still be making comments without any MSPs, which may have an impact.
The other figures that came out in that recent poll was about personal ratings amongst politicians, and in Scotland, only Nicola Sturgeon and Anis Sarwar have got positive personal ratings once people who don't like them's figures are taken off. Interestingly, Alex Salmond is running at minus 64 personal rating, which means that to Scottish voters, Alex Salmond is less popular than Boris Johnson, which by any standards is quite an achievement. So turning very briefly to our Prime Minister, obviously he and his old pal Dominic Cummings have been in the news this week. There's been a bit of a falling out of thieves, Anthony, hasn't there? Is it something we should be interested in? Is it relevant, or is it just a sideshow?
Well, it does matter, of course, how the UK state is run, regardless of anyone's view on independence. Not least because obviously the UK would be a neighbour of an independent Scotland. It would be in Scotland's interest for the UK to be a stable, well-functioning, well-run country. So yes, it does matter, unfortunately, because it seems that there's sort of one scandal or misstep after another in respect of how the UK government functions at a political level, anyway. And I guess the question is, what kind of accountability and checking are the Labour Party providing or not providing in these circumstances? Of course, you could say the SNP as well, but given Labour are meant to be the official opposition, are they really, not just saying, UK government or Boris Johnson, you're failing here, or with this, but are they actually having much of an impact and holding to account? I think the general view on that is not really.
Well, no, because the Conservative majority keeps increasing, keeps increasing. Not the majority, but the gap between Labour and Conservative and voting intention keeps increasing. So I really don't think the opposition are having much of an impact. The former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, who lost his job last year, recently said that Johnson was a vacuum of integrity running a cronyist cabal. Now, obviously, Fatima, the sleaze and cronyism is coming out. There's not a week, not a day goes by we don't hear something else about it. And we can just dismiss it as being typical of Johnson. And really, do we care what Dominic Cummings says? He can't be believed about anything anyway. But I'm wondering, as someone who's aspiring to be an elected representative in a couple of weeks, are you concerned that this constant barrage and narrative that politicians are corrupt? Because let's be honest, cronyism is corruption. Let's call it what it is. Are you concerned that that is affecting people's general attitudes to politicians, turning people off politics and politicians?
Yeah, it looks like politicians are kind of escape any accountability. Like even looking across the pond to the amount of things that Donald Trump got away with, for example. So people, because it's the taxpayers are the ones putting these politicians in place, and we're seeing a list of concerning examples of Westminster and UK government cronyism, and the UK government has a lot to answer for. It must come clean because taxpayers have a right to know. But this image that we're seeing is absolutely not good at all, and I think it just goes down to the fact that we have elected some people in government who are far removed from the world problems and who are there for the wrong reasons too, because it's a privilege. And if you have the right people there, they certainly won't be engaging in this kind of behavior or activity. So I think it just comes down to a lot of them are there because of privilege. And I think that privilege just protects them in a way. So that's why I'm all for making Parliament more representative and more diverse, because I think in a way we will move away from this status quo of privilege and people who think that they're void of any responsibility and think they can get away with corrupt practices as well. So absolutely, it's not a good image, but I know that for a fact that it's not all politicians. We have really great ones, and it's just a shame that the bad few are the ones taking the limelight.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, there will always be people who say politicians are all the same. I
Yeah.
don't vote, I don't engage with politics. There will always be that cohort of people. But I'm hearing it a bit more from people that I know who are, I would have thought, quite political, who would have engaged with politics, who certainly for this election in Scotland, not necessarily a reflection of what's been happening in Scotland, but are just turning off. And that's a worry, I think. Um, Anthony, you mentioned one of the things that was kind of missing from all of the manifestos really was Brexit, as if it never happened. And maybe that's really the only way that certainly the Conservative Party and to some extent Labour, who really didn't defend Europe very well, can deal with the mess that they've made. But we've had a bit of a stooshy in Scotland just this week over the potential impact of a hard border or some form of border having to be created between England and Scotland come independence. I don't know if you saw the story, but Emma Harper, who's standing for election down in the southwest, made some comment around that a hard border, might help with job creation, and that's caused a real furore with Nicola Sturgeon coming out saying Scotland don't want a hard border with England. They want to trade freely across the UK and trade freely with the EU. Given the things, Anthony, we're seeing with Northern Ireland, how likely is it, do you think, if we became independent and joined the EU, that we could avoid a hard border?
Well, that's the billion-euro question. So, the border issue, it's important to the independence debate. I mean, there's no denying that. But, from my perspective, I think it's important to try to, I wouldn't say de-emphasize it, but try to take a lot of the emotion out of it, because there's talk, oh, there'll be a border between Scotland and England. What would this mean for us? Of course there would be a border. In some dimension, there's a border right now, but that would be the whole point of becoming independent. The border would differentiate between where Scotland was and where England was, and where the EU was and where the EU wasn't. And if we could try to move our debate into that kind of space, I think that would be better for all of us. I suppose it should be fairly evident now that if Scotland's in the EU and the UK isn't, that there will be a border in respect of goods. Obviously, the proposal from the SNP and others is that Scotland would still be in the common travel area, so there would still be movement of people, but not of goods. And as long as the UK still has this Brexit deal with the EU, then that would be unavoidable. I suppose the thing which might change is that it seems very unlikely now, but it is possible in the future that the UK, and by the UK here I mean England and Wales, since they voted for Brexit, could decide that they wanted to have a closer relationship with the EU. And if that were to happen and the EU were to agree, then that might make things easier. But obviously having a border is something that which is manageable. It's the case for countries around the world, between Norway and Sweden, between the United States and Canada. Those states are still functioning and they still trade with each other. And I'm sure that'll be the same thing for Scotland and England.
Am I right in saying though that if we did have a common travel area, which I know is the SNP's kind of answer to this question, that's really up to England, isn't it? I mean, Scotland can't just say unilaterally we're going to have a common travel area with the rest of the UK. And how likely are England to agree to that, do you think? I mean, I know that's difficult to answer because you don't know who will be running England in those days. But what do you think the likelihood is that England would say that's something in their interests?
Yeah, on balance, given where we are at the moment, I think it is probably likely that the rest of the UK or England here would agree to common travel area, not least considering that there's Ireland as part of the common travel area, obviously. And Ireland is independent in the EU, and that works out fine for them. So why wouldn't it be the same for Scotland? obviously the alternative, if that were to be the case, would be, would Scotland seriously consider joining the Schengen area instead? I think that's a challenging question, which, I suppose we can't say what England would do, but I imagine they would want to have a common travel area, I would think.
But when Brexit was being negotiated and the Irish question kept coming up, people in Scotland were watching very carefully what happened, because there was a suggestion that there would really be no hard border. There would be a soft border. It would be some technological border. Some people even thought that maybe it would be run by leprechauns. It was about as likely as a soft border. And of course, none of that's happened. We now effectively have a hard border in the Irish Sea. So is that going to cause people in Scotland, especially people who trade with the rest of the UK, some sleepless nights, that they're going to have exactly the same problems that Northern Ireland businesses are having trading with the rest of the UK? That's for you, Anthony.
Thank you. Yes, well, I'm sure. Well, I mean, if there's a border, a regulatory border, and a goods border between Scotland and the rest of the UK, which in this case would be England, and also Northern Ireland in respective of sea travel and sea trade, then yes, it's perfectly possible there could be challenges. I suppose what you might say is that, it would be useful to try to learn whatever lessons you could from the disruption which Northern Ireland traders faced trading into the UK, and try to prepare for that. And to, generally speaking, we would very much hope and expect that the preparations for independence would be much greater and better than the non-preparations for Brexit by the UK government. In other words, the Scottish government would prepare for independence infinitely better than the UK government prepared for Brexit, and that might help.
Well, your response to this is very calm, it's very measured. It's clearly what's needed in this debate, because, as you've just said, emotion runs high. And I think, Fatima, this is an emotive issue, isn't it, the idea of border? So it came up in 2014. The Unionist side started scaremongering that there would be a border. And of course, at that point, the UK was in Europe. Scotland was hoping it would be in Europe as an independent country. So there would have been no need for a border. But that situation now has changed. And there's something about the idea that you might need to show a passport to drive from Hoyok to Carlisle that upsets people, especially when you consider families are spread across the UK. So how do you think this should be tackled by the SNP and the Greens? What sort of messages should they be sending out? Because what worries me is the border question becomes the next referendum's currency question that it was in 2014. And a lot of people think that's what lost the referendum. There weren't sufficiently robust answers on currency. And if we don't have robust answers on border, it could be the thing that stops it happening again. So what should the SNP and the Greens be doing about this?
So we will enter into periods of negotiations, and I think, from my own understanding and from what I would like to see personally, is because I understand independence is a way for us to be able to make our own decisions, and by the people elected, by people elected in Scotland, and by the Scottish government. But achieving independence is not a way to close off ties and relationships with our neighbouring countries. We would like to keep trade relations with our closest neighbours, which is England. So certainly I don't see any parties pushing for a hard border or wanting that, because we're seeing the consequences of it already. It's deeply unfortunate that we're now seeing exporters to the UK reviewing their business models and given the associated costs of trade with the EU. Which is both Scotland's and the UK's largest trading partner by far. And Scotland, we wouldn't want to see that at all. We would hope to keep our trade relationship good, because the independence is not a hate campaign. It's not an isolationist campaign. It's just about Scotland's right to choose. Due to unfair circumstances. But I would certainly like to see a civil approach taken, negotiations that realise that it's in everyone's best interest to keep trade smooth and soft, but and absolutely stay away from the hard consequences of what we're seeing with the EU just now.
Anthony, the spectre of Scotland joining EFTA before even considering joining the EU has emerged again. I think it's something that Alba have been putting out there, although it was also Nicola Sturgeon's view in 2017 that joining EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, before considering joining the EU might be a positive thing to do. What would, as far as you're concerned, what would be the benefits of Scotland applying to join EFTA if independence is won?
Anyone who's familiar with my work, or perhaps what I've said before on this program, knows that I don't think it's a good idea for Scotland to join EFTA generally, but I most certainly think it's not a good idea for Scotland to join EFTA as some supposed stepping stone to EU membership. I suppose we take them in turn. First of all, EFTA needs to be joined with the EEA, the European Economic Area, for it to mean anything. If you just join EFTA on your own, which is fairly easy to do, all things considered, that's a relationship with the members of EFTA, which is Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, which is not going to do you much in the way of trade. If you want anything of substance, you need to join the EEA afterwards, and that would require the agreement of all the EU member states. To condense that means it would take time. It would probably take several years for Scotland to join the EEA. It would also take several years to join the EU, for instance. And obviously, you pay equivalent contribution to the EU budget, you don't vote on anything, you accept all the laws that apply to the EEA and implement them, and so on. So therefore, I don't think the EEA is a good option under independence. But if you want secondly, if you want to join the EU, what kind of relationship do you have between the time Scotland is independent, between the time it becomes an EU member? It's a very important question. I don't think that's EFTA or the EEA. I think that's through an association agreement, as I wrote in my EU e-print, for instance, between Scotland and the EU. And I suppose the fundamental point which I would mention is that, under an association agreement and the way I set out in the blueprint, that could potentially be ready, as soon as Scotland was independent, whereas EFTA EEA membership wouldn't be. You couldn't apply to join EFTA until the day of independence, and then you'd be left with another cliff edge. And the only alternative would be to stay in the Brexit deal, for instance, if the EU agreed to that and the UK agreed to that. And obviously that wouldn't be a really great thing. So, to my mind, I think this argument, insofar as the argument, is pretty clear.
So EFTA wouldn't give Scotland access to the single market, as is being claimed.
You'd have to join the European Economic Area as well.
And that's the thing that would take almost as long as joining the EU.
Well, look, I think, so to join EFTA and the EEA, you have to do them together. You do one and then two. I would think that would probably take, at least 2 years or so for Scotland to join EEA EFTA, or I'd estimate it would take about 4 to 5 years for Scotland to join the EU. But more to the point, it's not just a question of, we could join the EEA and then we'd sort of be in the single market, wouldn't that be great? And then we could just hop over to the EU when it suited us. It's about, what first of all, what is the EU going to agree to? And secondly, the EU, if you want to be part of the EU want to see that you're committed to being an EU member state, fulfilling the obligations of membership and playing your full role in the EU, not just sort of seeking whatever is most convenient for trade. And thirdly, of course, trade is important, but the whole point of the European is about using economic means for political ends. That's to say, using trade and cooperation to foster greater peace and prosperity in Europe, and that all the other policies and all the other things that the EU stands for, whether that's working together on democracy or climate change or whatever, that you want to be part of those or not. Are you wanting to join the EU just because you want to trade with it, which is basically why the UK joined the EU, or is it because you believe in what the EU stands for and want to be part of it?
I do know that countries like Norway, who are in the EEA, often refer to it as a government by fax. They get told that they've got to do a lot of things, but they don't have an awful lot of input or say, but it does cost them money. But of course, that was one of the potential options when Brexit was being discussed. There was even a suggestion that those parts of the UK who voted to remain in Brexit could have a special deal. Obviously, that wasn't going to be possible. So, Fatima, what is the SNP's view on EFTA or EEA? Are they suggesting this stepping stone approach, which Anthony seems to suggest wouldn't go down very well with the EU, or would they be pushing for full membership of the EU? And is there an intention, do you know, to have another referendum on that?
We are certainly pushing for full membership of the EU because we didn't want to leave in the first place. Scotland didn't want to leave. So we need to take that into consideration, absolutely. So in turn, my answer won't be as technical as Andrew's because I'm not aware of all the nitty gritty aspects of this because it's not my expertise at all. But I am certainly aware we are a party that is pro EU. We want to be full members of the EU. We believe it's possible. We've seen the evidence, the spoken evidence from other EU member states saying that Scotland would be welcome, and that an independent Scotland would be welcome back in the EU. In terms of the course we're going to take into the EU, I'm not 100% sure, so I won't comment on that just now. But no, I can be very clear that we are pushing for full EU membership, and independent Scotland is.
Anthony, do you think it would be that independent Scotland would have to have another referendum on entry into the EU to make sure that people were committed to joining whatever the EU looks like in a few years? Because the EU that we wanted to stay in 2016 is already quite different. I mean, look at the issue around vaccinations. If we'd still been in the EU, maybe we wouldn't be able to read out these fantastic vaccination statistics that we do every day on the programme. So do you think it would be important for there to be another referendum on membership of the EU if Scotland gains independence?
I suppose there are two aspects to this. One is that if what would the EU expect? Now, what the EU expects is that Scotland would follow what we would call its constitutional requirements. Basically means whatever was in the Scottish Constitution. That could be a referendum or a vote in Parliament or whatever. And as long as that happens, the EU would be satisfied. So if it was not a legal requirement in Scotland to have a referendum and one didn't happen, the EU would be fine with that. The question is, what do we want to have happen here? As I said out in the EU blueprint, I think there should be a referendum. I think the question is, when should that referendum be? Because of course, most countries these days, when they join the EU, they do hold a referendum, but it's not at the beginning to decide whether or not you join, because you kind of think a decision as important as you kind of have a feeling of what the public mood was. You hold that referendum after the negotiations are done, once the treaty is negotiated and signed provisionally, so that the full detail of what EU membership would specifically mean for Scotland would be before everyone. The full text would be there, be analysed by commentators and others, and then you would vote on that. And then it'd be very simple and very straightforward of, here are the terms of membership, do you agree with them or not? And I believe that is the kind of referendum which we should have, because it's a very important constitutional decision for Scotland joining the EU. And of course, the people should have their say on whether or not they agree with it. I just think that it's better to do it once you have the full terms rather than at the very start.
You said that what the EU want from its members are people who are committed to membership, and specifically committed to the movement, because these are the underpinning principles of the EU. But there's been discussion in the EU for some time now about the fact that I think people recognise the EU does need reform. One of the things it needs to think about, for example, is how it deals with non-sovereign states within sovereign states across Europe who may or may not have different attitudes and views of the EU. And just, I think this week or the end of last week, Angela Merkel, using the issue around health provision and COVID-19, said that she could see a time when members didn't necessarily have to sign up for every part of the EU. So there's been some discussion in the EU, and I've no idea how senior that is, but I know I've been aware of it, that in the future there might almost be a two-tier EU where not everyone signs up for all of the movements, for example, or all of the membership requirements, but can kind of pick and choose. So, one, is that feasible, or is that just wishful thinking on behalf of some people? And would that be, if it was feasible, would that be a useful way of help keeping some countries who are looking at the UK's exit and thinking, well, problems aside that they're having, that's something we might be considering. I mean, there are quite a lot of countries who are not happy with the way the EU operates. So what do you think, Anthony? Is that feasible or just a fairy tale?
This concept of a multi-tiered Europe or multi-tiers of membership is not new. It's been around for a while. It resurfaces every once in a while. And the short version is, I don't think it's feasible. One is that the EU has been able to make it this far without having a differentiated sort of multi-membership model. Two is that a number of member states would never agree to that. You'd need all the member states to agree to make that kind of change because they fear being left behind. So for them, countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, it's not a question of here there are two tiers and you can choose to be in one or the other, they feel they'll be forced into the second tier, even though they don't want to be. So for a variety of reasons, I don't see that happening. And two is that, there is already potential for differentiation within the European Union, on certain policies. For instance, on some sort of taxation issues where you want to cooperate together when several EU member states tried a financial or transactions tax where some participate and others don't. That kind of thing is already allowed under EU rules. And obviously there are definitely crucial, important questions about what is the future direction of the European Union and how much power should be at EU level as opposed to sort of member state level or even other levels lower than member state level. But I don't imagine the solution to that would be a sort of multi-tier Europe because that just doesn't suit the member states as a whole. But no, obviously France and Germany, they always have their different views on what is the future direction of the EU. And I'm sure that the coronavirus and obviously the challenges with vaccine procurement have fed into that. But I don't think that it's going to result in fundamental changes in the EU in the sense of multi-tiered model.
Well, one change that will be coming to the EU this September is that Angela Merkel will be standing down as German Chancellor, and she has been the greatest defender of the EU. But she's also someone who's aware of its weaknesses and has tried very often to broach agreements with states who are struggling. She tried, I think, very hard in the beginning to accommodate the UK's concerns. And I think depending on who takes over from her, that could make quite a difference if they have a slightly different attitude to the EU, whether they're more in line with France's view or differentiated. So we'll keep a watching brief on that. And perhaps, Anthony, when Angela Merkel goes, we'll have you back on the programme to discuss that. The other big story that has been running now for weeks, obviously, was the trial of Chauvin, who was convicted of the murder of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd, of course, was what kicked off the Black Lives Matter campaign, or movement rather. And yet, despite the fact that Chauvin was convicted on all three counts, the numbers of black people being shot in America by police continues to rise. There's been 2 this week. The amount of gun crime in the United States continues to rise. This week saw the anniversary of Stephen Lawrence Day, 28 years since Stephen Lawrence was killed in a racially motivated crime. And one of the key things from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was the phrase institutional racism was applied to the Metropolitan Police. And despite the fact the initial inquiry produced over 70 recommendations, many of these recommendations, according to Diane Abbott this week, remain unacted on. So I'm just wondering what, Anthony, given that no doubt the Chauvin verdict was hugely important, what do you think the legacy of Black Lives Matter might be in, let's say, the coming year to 18 months, given that Biden's been fairly firm about what he would like to see on a federal basis?
I think that there is potential for real change to happen. I think the potential, because obviously we have been let down before on these kinds of things, but potential for change in the way that has not existed before, which is to say that Joe Biden has, in terms of his rhetoric, has put racial justice as one of the key themes of his administration. Obviously, the administration is new. It remains to be seen how much they achieve to be judged on that standard. But it's important to have that. There, through the course of the campaign, the presidential campaign, and even before that, there are a number of concrete things that Biden could do to demonstrate that he's serious, which I hope that he does. And of course, one of them is using the pardon power. So, for instance, the federal pardon power, which Donald Trump basically only used once in a while for his friends. But there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people serving 100-year prison sentences for relatively minor drug offenses, with a large proportion of whom are black, for instance, under laws which Joe Biden had a role in passing to increase federal sentencing. He could start to issue pardons for many of those people, for instance, which would be one small tangible step towards making progress. But in the broader picture, as with most issues in the United States, regrettably, even issues that should be about values get slotted to party issues. So you have lots of Democrats saying that they're in favor of racial justice. Republicans not saying that they're not in favor of it, but in their actions making it clear that they favor an alternative view. And the bipartisan gridlock continues. And I guess the question is, to what extent will the Democrats, with their slim majority in the Senate, be able to bring their coalitions of different people of different persuasions, from progressive through to centrist, which Biden is normally a centrist, to actually effect real change? And I guess we'll have to see.
So would you say you're more or less hopeful of racial justice as a result of Black Lives Matter?
I'm more hopeful, but I said racism has defined the United States since before it was created. We're talking about hundreds of years of inequity, and it would be really nice to see both political parties in favor of justice and reform. So I'm cautiously optimistic here, but the United States does not have a good record on these things, so I guess we'll have to see.
Fatima, there's been an accusation that some people in the United Kingdom have been kind of snooty about all of this and, tutting and look at how bad racism is in the United States. And actually, racism is just as big an issue here. In terms of Scotland, what are your, either from your own personal experience or just from the experience of others, how racist is Scotland? That's the simple question. How racist is Scotland? Because we can sometimes be quite complacent.
Yeah, if I can first come on to George Floyd before I come on to the issue of racism in Scotland, I would just like to say, because one thing that an argument as a black person I keep hearing thrown back at me is, oh, he was this, he was that, he had a criminal record, but that should not excuse the treatment he suffered at the hands of the police. It should not excuse the treatment anyone suffers at the hands of in that way, and nor should it excuse any racial injustice he was afforded. So I am horrified at the brutal killing of George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matter has existed for a while, but has grown in prominence ever since. And the fact that people haven't realized that it has existed for a while does say a lot about our rhetoric around racism. We don't talk about it as much. We don't have an open and frank conversation. I think George Floyd, at the killing of George Floyd, brought the Black Lives Matter movement to the forefront, gave it more of a voice. So with that, we are seeing it obviously going to each country now. Every country has been forced to look at how they deal with racism, and Scotland included, because it is a sad fact that no country is immune from racism. And we must make clear that it's an evil that has no place in our society. And that includes Scotland, that includes England, that includes the rest of the UK, that includes all over the world. And I can see that within my party, we are committed to playing our part in eradicating racism, inequality, and injustice, and to build a better, fairer Scotland for everyone. And that's why when this report came out, and it did it rightly met widespread criticism and concern, the race review, and as Boris Johnson even described it as stimulating and interesting. And when this is the very same report that attempts to put a positive cultural spin on the abhorrent slave trade as a Caribbean experience. So we do have a lot to confront here in terms of that. So down to my own experiences, recognizing that racism is real, whether the results of the report tend to downplay it, well, it actually downplays it and attempts to rewrite it. Racism is real. It is an experience. Like as a young person, I was actually in a Stephen Lawrence. I spoke at a Stephen Lawrence event over the weekend. No, sorry, during the week. Sorry, and We were asked about our individual experiences of racism, and the really interesting thing is a lot of us. It took hindsight. It took growing up to realize that we did encounter aspects of racism. Mine was in primary school. I didn't realize there was a particular incident, and with a teacher, and it took leaving primary school to realize that this was a racist incident, but I was too young to understand it. So I think there's so much lack of awareness, and we really need to do all we can to address it. So absolutely, it is real, and that report, I completely reject it.
Anthony, do you think we are a bit complacent in Scotland? We have this vision of ourselves as being these much nicer than the rest of the UK and much more open, and it's all about Rabbie Burns and all of that. But there's not really an awful lot of evidence when you look at attitudinal studies of there being much difference in attitudes across the UK. So are we complacent in Scotland that we're doing the equality thing better?
I think important not to think that Scotland, as Fatima has already said, is immune from racism or does not have race. We don't have racism here in Scotland. Of course we do. But at the same time, I think there's nothing. It's good that we have a positive national story. It's good to say that Scotland is a welcoming country, and it's good to say that there'll be job tents and spares and all of that. That's good to have. The question is linking those aspirations with what actually happens in Scotland in terms of individual people's daily lives and lived experiences, both in the way institutions are designed and people's attitudes. And I think if we are all in place to accept that each of us, we all play a part in trying to create the society that we want. It's good to have positive aspirations, but we need to actively work to achieve them.
I think one of the differences in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK, and clearly this was one of the things that came out in Brexit, the othering of people who are not like the white majority by politicians in Scotland happens less often. It's not really entered the political fray. There's nobody in Scotland, certainly in the main parties, and we'll leave the lunatic fringe aside for the moment, who is advocating that we make major splits in society, that we focus on one group as being less important than another, leaving aside Douglas Ross's comments on gypsy travellers recently. But it's generally not part of the political discourse in the way that it plays out in parts of England. And as a result, the media in Scotland haven't really got any vested interest in flaring that up, because it's not supporting one political agenda or another. And the great myth about the media and journalism is that it reflects public opinion, where we know that it actually creates public opinion, usually for the agenda of someone else. So I think we're fairly lucky, but we can't predict that that's going to continue. We are seeing a rise of right-wing fringe parties showing interest in Scotland, as a lot have joined the debate and the current election. They won't get anywhere, but they are acting as a focus and a place where people who share these right-wing views can sit. And typically their attitudes about race, their attitudes about women, their attitudes about LGBTQ, their attitudes about not supporting stem cell research, all of that kind of thing. So, Fatima, what can we do to make sure, and practical ideas if you've got any, to make sure that those views don't become more acceptable within mainstream politics? Remember, Brexit happened because a fringe party put the fear of God into a mainstream party to support that initiative. Leaving the EU was never a mainstream feature of the Conservative Party. So what can we do to stop these insidious, divisive ideas filtering into mainstream parties?
So, personally, and I've taken this to the Scottish National Party conference, there is evidence that decolonising the curriculum is actually one way to go, because right from primary school, hate is, no one's born to hate, no one's born to be racist. It's taught and it's learned behaviour. So I propose tackling it from the early years, and one way of doing that is decolonising our curriculum. And I think, let me just clarify what I mean by decolonizing the curriculum, because rather surprisingly, I was at a hustings during the week, and a senior politician didn't understand what it meant. They thought it was simply teaching the transatlantic slave trade to their students, letting them know about slavery and slave trade, but that's not simply it. Decolonizing the curriculum involves quite a good overhaul of our curriculum. That means that we are pulling on sources, diverse sources, and we're actually teaching the realities of our history. So not just about, oh, slavery did happen. We need to look at why it happened and own up to our own mistakes, and understand how our colonial practices did actually create more harm than good. And it's not a way to demonize us, or it's not a way to paint us in a negative light, but it's a way to understand where we are and how we can correct it, because it is a problem that needs to be readdressed. So I proposed a practical step, obviously decolonising the curriculum. Two of my colleagues actually managed to pass this through at their local council level. I think it was South Lanarkshire Council. So they were able to actually pass this through. It did meet some opposition from politicians, which comes to my second point. Political parties, we're at the decision making table. We need to be able to take a proactive step in this and understanding structural racism and how we can effectively tackle it in all aspects of life. And that includes mainstreaming race equality throughout everything that we do, because political parties, I'm not going to name names, but some of them are quite resistant to some proposals of how we tackle racism. I think some are in denial, and some did challenge my colleagues' motion, which did pass through, but they did challenge it in a way. And it involved a non-BAME person trying to school a BAME person in their own experiences, for example. So I think political parties have a pivotal role to play in this, and how they set the national tone in their debates and their policies, and how we address this. So we need to mainstream race equality, and I know that the Scottish National Party has committed to introducing a Scottish diversity and inclusion strategy covering the public sector, our educational institutions, our justice system, and workplace, to focus on the removal of institutional and cultural barriers which lead to inequalities in different identities such as gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and social mobility. So it's clear there are still barriers to overcome, and there are some practical steps. I think it just boils down to whether we are brave enough to actually take them, because this requires radical steps. We're past the point of just having of just talking. Now we need action, and the action needs to be bold, and that means looking into uncomfortable truths as well, which I know is hard to do, but we really need to start.
And I think you're right. I think the diversity and inclusion strategy, when it's taken in conjunction with the plans to embed international human rights treaties into Scots law, are going to send out a very strong message about that national tone, which comes back to how Anthony started this part of the conversation, saying it's a good story to have. Our final story of today makes us think about COVID again. Just as we're looking forward to things finally unlocking in Scotland, we're seeing infection rates fall. We're really very fortunate, but we know, of course, that's not the case across the world. And the story this week, which has been completely shocking, is the appalling rise of cases in India. There have been 1 million infections in 3 days, but worse than that, India is running out of oxygen. People are dying because they don't have oxygen. Anthony, what is happening? What is the reason? Is it incompetence on behalf of the Indian government? Is it just the size of the spread? Is it corruption? Why on earth is India running out of oxygen?
Well, I mean, Indian politics and current affairs is not an area of expertise of mine, but saying from the little that I do know, it seems that the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is, for instance, the election campaign ongoing, and he's keen to sort of, have some degree of normality in India. Perhaps whether or not that was the wisest in terms of the epidemiological situation. But I mean, India is such a large country, over 1 billion people. I imagine any major public health situation or crisis can be very challenging to deal with. Plus, when you add in the wide disparities in terms of poverty between some people versus others, I don't know the specific circumstances of why they're running out of oxygen. But I do know that it indicates that this pandemic is still with us, even though we here, for instance, are starting to see a lifting of restrictions. The situation can always still get bad quickly. And that's why it's incumbent on all of us, in our own small way, to continue to follow the rules that are set for us to ensure that we collectively can try to get through this pandemic as a globe.
Fatima, we know that poverty has been one of the contributing factors in the UK for why certain groups of people are more likely to suffer from getting the infection and suffering more as a result of it. And obviously, as Anthony says, there is a huge disparity of wealth in India for people who are incredibly poor, who are living in conditions where social distancing just isn't possible. But it can't be the first public health emergency. It just isn't the first public health emergency that India has had. Do you think there's any sense that at some point within the Indian structure, or perhaps even within government, there's a feeling that perhaps some groups in India are dispensable, or is that taking it too far?
I think I'll start from the global level, first of all, in terms of vaccinations and the inequalities in vaccinations stockpiled and on order between countries we see today sadly mirrors the socio-economic inequalities between countries more generally. So I think we need to approach it from that, first of all, to understand India's lack of vaccinations, for example. That's one reason. And if we look at news outlet, I think it was Reuters, they saw documents that reveal that the global scheme to deliver vaccines to the world's poorest countries faces a very high risk of failure, with some countries having to wait until 2024 to see a full rollout. And that should absolutely worry us all. Sorry. And so, having said that, now we understand that already countries like India would struggle to have access to these vaccinations. Then, if we look within the world's most poorest countries, um, they're they are behind in delivering to people, and I do sense that there is some sort of because I don't understand their planning. I haven't really looked into their planning because I know that in the UK we follow the JCVI Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations, who advise on how we do the vaccine rollout. But I'm not certain. I'm not certain about how India is going about it. But it looks like there is some inequality in the rollout in the vaccination. I think that
I think that the fact
bigger
is
question is
we'll
social
not be safe
inequalities.
until everybody's safe. So although things
Yeah,
are
yeah.
heading in the
So that's the thing.
absolute
So there's a
right
global
direction in the
responsibility.
UK,
Yeah,
we can't forget. So on
yeah.
that note, it just reminds me to thank my guests today, to remind you that things are opening up more in Scotland next week. So be careful. Don't go mad. Just remember to keep your distance, wear your mask, wash your hands. Because, as we've just discovered, the virus is still out there and it's a lot closer than India that's rampaging its way through Europe at the moment. So let's keep safe and let's keep heading in the right direction. Um, it takes money to make these programmes, and Broadcasting Scotland are inviting you, if you've enjoyed the programme, to make a donation to help us continue to produce quality independent journalism. You can go online to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see how you can help make a donation to keep us going. It's been enjoyable being with you this afternoon, and have a nice weekend. It's a lovely sunny day out there, but be careful and no more than 6 of you in a group at a time. And yes, I'm wagging my finger. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Fatima. Good afternoon.